I learned the hard way that a signature can tell the truth long before a person ever does. That's where my story begins. Not with a fight, not with a breakup, but with the quiet moment I realized the man I was about to marry believed confidence could replace responsibility. We were deep into the wedding preparations then. Deposits paid, dates confirmed, families notified, invitations mailed. Everything was moving forward, every detail tightly woven into the life we thought we were building together. But beneath all of that, beneath the celebration, the photos, the smiles, something else was forming. A fracture. Thin at first, almost invisible. Then one sentence from him, typed casually in a parking lot, split everything open. "If you don't sign, we cancel the wedding." It didn't sound emotional. It sounded procedural. And maybe that was why it landed so deeply. I had covered most of the expenses, quietly, willingly, believing partnership meant shared structure. But the moment he turned our future into a transaction, I realized something essential. Clarity protects you more than love ever can, when love becomes conditional. What followed was not an argument, but a process. A slow unraveling of truth through receipts, messages, deadlines, and the kind of silence that exposes who people really are when consequences arrive. This is the story of how a wedding unraveled, not in chaos, but in calm precision. How a woman discovers that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight, but to follow the structure someone else set in motion, all the way to the end. If you want more stories like this, quiet, sharp, and deeply human, make sure to subscribe to the channel. My calendar lay open beside the kitchen table, the soft glow from the porch light brushing over the stack of envelopes I hadn't gotten around to sealing. The paper smelled new, sharp, almost sweet, its edges still stiff, as if resisting the shape it was supposed to take. I slid my chair in carefully, mindful of the quiet. It felt like the kind of night where even small sounds carried too far. I touched the corner of the thickest envelope, the one holding our final vendor confirmations, and pressed it flat against the wood, as though anchoring it could stop anything from shifting. The house was steady, still, familiar. My hands, usually sure during any kind of paperwork, hesitated for the first time in months as I traced the timeline leading up to the wedding. There was something oddly steady about the preparation process, like following a well-drawn map, but tonight the air felt different, uncertain. The porch light flickered once, faintly, then steadied again. I exhaled. Nothing had happened yet, but my body registered something before my mind caught up. My phone buzzed 3 times on the table, then stopped abruptly, as if the message itself wanted to be dramatic. The screen lit up with his name and a short line that looked strangely mechanical for someone I was supposed to marry. "Just sign the prenup. Makes it faster." No greeting, no explanation, no softness, just a directive. I opened the document he'd sent earlier and began marking the parts that already didn't sit right. The lopsided protections, the clauses without mutual language, the phrasing that implied I was entering a contract alone. I circled a section in red, took a screenshot, and saved it with the timestamp like my lawyer had told me. Always record, always preserve. The way he phrased things had become clipped lately, efficient, like he was discussing logistics with a colleague rather than planning a life with a partner. I held the phone a moment longer than necessary, waiting to see if he'd follow up with a call, something human. He didn't. I typed back slowly, choosing each word as carefully as if I were drafting a deposition rather than answering a fiancé. "We'll review it with both attorneys first." A simple boundary, nothing more, nothing less. The kind that should have reassured both of us that fairness mattered. The steel pen, his engagement gift to me, rested beside the open folder. I tapped it lightly against my thumbnail and heard a small, hollow click. The sound felt too loud in the quiet room. I remembered how he'd handed the pen to me the night he proposed, saying it was for signing our future. The phrasing had sounded romantic at the time. Tonight, it sounded like a line rehearsed for a different purpose. I set the pen down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the folder's edge, a habit I'd picked up from years of reviewing documents. The silence felt like it was waiting for my next move, but I didn't rush. Precision mattered, especially now. The cool metal of the pen brushed against my wrist when I reached for the folder again, and the sensation sent a thin ripple down my arm. It reminded me of that first night, how he'd pressed the pen into my hand gently, like it carried meaning beyond ink and paper. I'd believed it then. I'd wanted to. But objects don't lie. People do. And tonight the pen felt heavier, more utilitarian, stripped of romance. I skimmed through the prenup once more, recognizing the tone of whoever had drafted it. It wasn't collaborative. It wasn't protective. It was ownership dressed up as practicality. My heartbeat kept a slow, steady cadence, but something inside me tightened with each page I turned. I had always considered myself calm under pressure, but engagement wasn't supposed to feel like a negotiation. I let my fingers rest on the cold pen again, feeling its weight settle differently this time. No longer symbolic, just real. Real enough to wake me. I gathered my own documents, the invoices I'd paid, the receipts I'd filed, the correspondence I'd organized, and placed them neatly to the left side of the table. The separation felt necessary, like drawing a quiet line between what was his and what was mine. My breathing slowed, evened out. The chair didn't creak when I shifted, as though it understood the importance of maintaining composure. I stacked everything with deliberate care, smoothing each page until the edges lined up perfectly. Preparing for conversations like this required more than emotion. It required clarity, precision, and a willingness to see what was actually happening rather than what I hoped was happening. I wasn't angry, not yet, just awake, and aware that the evening had shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. The stakes crystallized slowly, like condensation forming on cold glass. If he brought this up tonight, if he pushed, insisted, framed it as something urgent or inevitable, I knew exactly what I would do. My backup folder sat waiting in the drawer beside me, labeled in plain black ink, Contingency, Personal. I'd prepared it weeks ago, not because I expected anything to happen, but because prudent people prepare. I rested my fingertips lightly against the folder's edge, feeling the steady hum of quiet resolve beneath my skin. I kept my eyes half lowered, not out of uncertainty, but out of deliberation, the way one might study themselves before giving sworn testimony. Silence, I'd learned, was its own form of answer, often the truest one. Whatever he expected from me tonight, whatever pressure he intended to apply, I had already chosen my ground. Calm wasn't passivity, it was preparation, and I was prepared. He placed the draft on the table between us earlier that afternoon, the way someone might slide a bill they didn't want to discuss. The language tilted unmistakably in his favor. Phrases wrapped around protecting his premarital assets, isolating financial exposure, and ensuring clarity. It read less like a mutual agreement and more like an insurance policy taken out against me. He didn't even look directly at me while explaining it. His tone stayed flat, almost procedural, as though fairness were optional. I skimmed the clauses again that evening, tracing the imbalance with a fingertip. The edges of the pages felt oddly coarse, catching against my skin. He had always been good at sounding reasonable, measured, composed, but the document revealed something beneath the polish, a quiet belief that his security mattered more than our partnership. Outside, the porch light hummed faintly, a thin reminder that the house was still steady even if the relationship was beginning to slope. I inhaled once, slowly, letting the weight of the draft settle into clarity. When I asked for time to review the document with my attorney, he exhaled like I'd suggested doing something extravagant instead of merely responsible. "We're just being efficient," he'd said, as though efficiency were the same as consent. That line echoed through my mind while I typed my formal request. I'll need to review this independently. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a basic right. I kept my message short, unadorned, the kind of clarity that couldn't be misinterpreted later. I'd learned that in corporate work. Precision prevented revisionist history. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji, a symbol so casually dismissive it carried its own kind of insult. I set my phone aside, focusing on my breath until it returned to an even rhythm. If one person treated a life-changing contract lightly, the other had to take it seriously enough for two. I opened a blank page in my notebook and began listing terms that needed correction. Definitions first. What counted as premarital property? What qualified as marital contributions? What protections were mutual rather than unilateral? Then I added notes about omitted sections. No acknowledgement of shared financial growth, no safeguards against coercion, no equitable dissolution clause. I drew a careful line under the phrase, no punitive provisions, because punitive language had no place in an agreement meant to support a marriage. The absence of fairness often revealed intent more clearly than the presence of cruelty. My steel pen tapped softly against the paper, marking each needed revision with a clean, deliberate motion. It was the same pen he'd gifted me, the same one he'd said symbolized partnership. Tonight it felt closer to a scalpel, precise, necessary, clinical. I kept my notes organized, aware that clarity now would prevent conflict later. A quiet discipline settled over me. He'd defended the draft earlier with a shrug and a thin smile. "It's just precaution. We're adults. We plan for risk." The tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't intimate either. It sounded like something he'd repeat to a stranger, a scripted justification polished for convenience. I remembered noticing the slight tremor at the edge of his mouth, barely perceptible, but there. Whether it was nerves or irritation, I couldn't tell. I hadn't pressed him on it. Pressing someone rarely got you truth. Observation did. Now the memory replayed with sharper context. His risk, his comfort, his assets, his concerns filled the document line by line. Ours didn't appear anywhere. The room around me remained still, quiet enough that I could hear the faint settling of the house. I wasn't angry at him. I was simply recognizing the truth already written in his own handwriting. I opened the folder where I'd kept every receipt related to the wedding, payments I'd made up front, deposits I'd secured, balancing each cost with methodical care. The stack had grown thicker over the months, heavy with practical commitment. I laid the receipts neatly in a row, a timeline of my investments, tangible and otherwise. Under the warm kitchen light, the ink on the oldest receipts had already begun to fade a little around the edges, proof that preparation had started long before any legal discussion. I traced the edge of the deposit slip for the venue, remembering how sure everything had felt then. These weren't just numbers, they were contributions, quiet, consistent, and entirely mine. I added each to a separate list, aligning their totals with the same precision I brought to everything that mattered. There would be no confusion later, not about what I brought, and not about what I deserved. By the time I finished sorting the documents, a different kind of clarity settled into place. If he insisted on a one-sided agreement, then I would create one that mirrored it, equal in structure, opposite in effect. Not revenge, balance, a quiet correction to a lopsided equation. I opened a new file and typed the title without hesitation. Provisions in the event of groom-initiated cancellation. The words aligned themselves neatly at the top of the page. Beneath them, I began outlining terms that protected my contributions, my time, and my dignity. Nothing dramatic, nothing vengeful, just accurate. What he'd drafted for himself, I would draft for myself. Two agreements side by side, each revealing the values of its author. I leaned back slightly, letting the stillness settle around me. Fairness didn't require permission. It required preparation. And I had always been prepared. My attorney sat across from me earlier that day, glasses low on his nose as he tapped a pen against the margin of the document. He wasn't dramatic, but he had a way of pausing that felt like a caution sign being raised. "Keep everything on email," he'd said, voice steady, measured. "Nothing verbal, nothing that can be reframed later." His fingers slid down the column outlining deadlines, enforceability requirements, and the importance of clear intent. Now, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I replayed the conversation mentally, absorbing the advice like a checklist. I opened my laptop and began forwarding our exchanges to a dedicated folder, labeling each according to date and topic. There was something grounding about the act, as though each file I saved reinforced a boundary that had already existed but had never been named. The house felt quieter tonight, as if listening to the rhythm of the keys beneath my fingers. I created a new document titled Ledger, Evidence, then began building it line by line. Emails, screenshots, call logs, each entry marked with its exact timestamp. He had messaged me at 8:12 p.m. the night he'd pushed the prenup. I marked that time with a small red star beside it, not for emotion but for clarity. Context mattered. Sequence mattered. The ledger grew in quiet increments, expanding like a slow, steady inhale. I imported screenshots of his texts, attaching the originals in a zipped folder so their metadata remained intact. Every detail carried its own weight. It wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about grounding myself in facts rather than assumptions. My hands moved with a calm I didn't entirely expect. There was no trembling, no hesitation, just the clean discipline of documentation. The cursor blinked at me between entries, patient, steady, almost reassuring. Next came the financial evidence, deposits I had made for the venue, the photography studio, and the band he'd insisted on. Each receipt had its own story, its own quiet timestamp of commitment. I scanned them one by one, aligning the files in a numbered sequence that read like a timeline. For a moment I paused at the deposit for the rings. I remembered the day clearly, the store's warm lighting, the quiet excitement we'd shared, the way he'd squeezed my hand as if promising something unspoken. That memory felt distant now, suspended somewhere between hope and hindsight. Still, I included the receipt without lingering. Personal sentiment couldn't interfere with clarity. I added each file to Annex B, creating a folder that stood parallel to the prenup draft he'd sent. 2 narratives forming simultaneously, one written, one documented. When I recorded our earlier conversation, I'd made sure to announce it clearly at the beginning, a lesson my attorney had repeated more than once. "I'm recording to ensure accuracy," I had said, my voice calm enough that even I was surprised. He didn't object. He simply kept talking, unaware of how each word aligned itself into the timeline I was now constructing. I imported the audio file into the ledger and labeled the key segment, marking the minutes where his tone shifted, where his phrasing tightened. Not as weapons, just as truth preserved. The house around me was still, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. I adjusted my headphones slightly, replaying a few lines to confirm their timestamps. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, only the quiet acknowledgement that preparedness didn't mean distrust. It meant stability. Before closing the laptop, I sent a final email confirming that his lawyer had officially received the prenup draft and all accompanying attachments. I requested written acknowledgement, not because I doubted the delivery, but because clarity worked best when mutual. A few minutes later, the read receipt popped up. Small, green, decisive. I added it to the ledger immediately. The room felt cooler now, the air brushing softly across my arms. I straightened the folders on the table, aligning them into a neat vertical column. Documentation had its own kind of order, its own quiet dignity. Nothing about this process felt dramatic. It simply felt necessary. When I closed the ledger, its weight felt larger than the sum of its entries. Not heavy, just solid. If words ever grew vague or emotions clouded recollection, the documentation would speak plainly. That was the point. Transparency didn't require permission. I added one final section at the bottom. 4.2. Termination by groom. Not because I wanted it invoked, but because agreements without clarity often left room for misinterpretation. The hour had grown late, but the quiet around me felt anchored rather than lonely. I rested my hand on the closed folder for a long moment, letting the steadiness settle into my breath. Nothing had been decided yet. Nothing irreversible had happened. But the groundwork was there. Clean, organized, undeniable. Facts, once recorded, rarely shift. People do. The parking lot was nearly empty when he pulled in, the headlights casting long, sharp lines across the asphalt. He didn't greet me when I approached the passenger side. He just lowered the window halfway, enough to speak but not enough to invite closeness. "If you don't sign," he said quietly, "we cancel the wedding." The sentence landed without ceremony, not loud, not cruel, just delivered like a logistical update. There were no gestures to soften it, no reaching for my hand the way he used to. The cold air moved between us like a witness. His eyes stayed on the steering wheel, tapping once as if timing himself. I listened without interrupting, letting the silence contour around the words he'd chosen. They were sharp, decisive, and entirely his. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The car idled, the faint hum of the engine carrying the weight of a decision he believed belonged only to him. I repeated his sentence back to him slowly, making sure the phrasing remained intact. "You're saying the wedding is conditional upon my signature?" My tone stayed level, almost neutral, the way one recites facts during a deposition. He shifted, uncomfortable, though he tried to hide it. "You're making it dramatic," he muttered. "I'm just being clear." But clarity wasn't the problem. The condition was. I watched his jaw tighten as he looked out the windshield instead of at me. He had always preferred control wrapped in gentleness, directives disguised as suggestions. Tonight, the disguise fell away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply confirmed the words because words, once spoken, become part of the record, first in memory, then in writing. His fingers drummed lightly against the console, but his gaze never lifted. I reached for my phone and, with a calm that felt almost rehearsed, pressed the button to save the recording of our conversation. The small icon glowed at the top of the screen, marking the moment the ultimatum entered the timeline. I forwarded the file to my own email, ensuring its timestamp matched the hour and location. The battery slipped from 16% to 15% as the message sent. A tiny drop, but noticeable, like the first shift in a larger pattern. I placed the phone back into my coat pocket gently, not wanting the gesture itself to look emotional. Across from me, he unlocked the car door, making a show of readiness to leave. The interior lights blinked on for a second, illuminating the tightness around his mouth. He had already mentally dismissed the conversation. I let the silence speak for itself. It often told truths people didn't intend to reveal. He opened the driver's door fully, the rush of cold air sweeping in. The smell of new car plastic hit me in a wave, sharp, synthetic, and somehow fitting for the moment. He didn't look back when he said, "I'm not arguing about this again." His tone tried for firmness, but landed closer to avoidance. I stood still beside the car, watching him adjust the seatbelt with quick, clipped movements. He wanted the last word, but he didn't want the responsibility of hearing mine. The glow from the overhead light cast a pale line across his forehead, emphasizing the distance between intention and consequence. Without responding, I opened my email app and typed a brief message summarizing our conversation in clean, objective language. "This evening, you stated that the wedding would be canceled if I declined to sign the presented prenup." I sent it to him, copied to myself. Documentation didn't ask for emotion, only accuracy. His phone vibrated on the console as the email arrived, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he started the engine, the vibration of the car masking the vibration of the notification. He kept his focus forward, jaw locked, shoulders drawn tight as if bracing for impact, or refusing to acknowledge one. I stepped back slightly, watching the taillights cast their red reflection over the pavement. The glow washed across the lower half of his face, cutting through the shadows that had softened his expression moments earlier. I didn't feel anger. I felt alignment, like something falling neatly into place after months of quiet imbalance. The conversation had spoken for itself. I tucked my hands into my coat pockets and waited until the engine settled into a steady rhythm. The cold air felt cleaner than the exchange we'd just had. Ultimatums have a way of revealing their authors. They sound bold in the moment, but they echo long after, shaping the narrative more sharply than intended. As he pulled away, the light from his brake lamps flickered over my shoes, then faded as he turned out of the lot. I remained where I was, letting the clarity settle. Not heavy, not painful, simply precise. If he believed the condition he'd set was leverage, he misunderstood leverage entirely. Words recorded themselves in memory, but documentation sealed them. I looked down at my phone, the email confirmation glowing quietly. The conversation was now part of the written timeline, preserved without embellishment. I didn't need to respond further. I didn't need to chase. Everything necessary had already been stated, by him, not me. I inhaled once, deeply, the cold air threading through my lungs with a steadiness I hadn't expected. I opened a new document the next morning, letting the blank page settle in front of me like a surface waiting for balance. If his agreement prioritized his protections, then mine would outline my own, calmly, proportionately, without dramatics. I typed the first clause cleanly. In the event of cancellation initiated by him, all contributions I had made toward the wedding would be returned to me, along with a modest correction for time and preparation lost. The language wasn't punitive, it was symmetrical. The house remained quiet as I drafted, sunlight grazing the edges of the table. Each sentence aligned itself with a clarity I hadn't needed to force. I wasn't writing out of hurt or suspicion. I was writing out of recognition. People showed you how they valued fairness. You simply had to respond in kind. When I reread the first page, it felt steady, measured, even compassionate in its precision. If he believed his document was reasonable, then he would have no objection to mine. And if he did object, the imbalance would reveal itself plainly. I attached the draft to an email addressed to his attorney, keeping the message concise. For review ahead of our mutual signing meeting. Ensures equal protection for both parties. Nothing more, no commentary, no insinuation. The cursor blinked once before I hit send. A quiet confirmation window appeared, and then the message disappeared into the thread of our growing documentation. A minute later, I organized the file into a folder marked Executed Agreements, Pending. The structure brought a certain calm, as if the simple act of placement gave the situation a framework it had been missing. He texted shortly after, "You really need all that?" The words carried that familiar tone of irritated efficiency, the kind people use when they're used to getting their way. I didn't respond. The document would speak for itself. I scheduled a joint signing meeting for the following afternoon, selecting a neutral office space with a small conference room. The calendar invite included both attorneys and the notary. No room for improvisation, no windows for misinterpretation. He accepted the invite without comment. 2 words appeared under his name. "Let's just get it done." He had always been brief, but brevity could carry attitude as much as it carried efficiency. I added the confirmation to the ledger, then turned my attention back to the formatting of the agreement, ensuring each clause mirrored the structure of his own. The balance was not in the content alone, it was in the architecture. When I closed the document, I felt a quiet steadiness settle into the room. Preparation was its own form of peace. Even if he misunderstood my intentions, I understood my own. His next message arrived hours later, abrupt and without punctuation. "Just sign it. Don't overthink." That was the tone he often used when he believed the matter should have been settled already. But decisions didn't become fair simply because one party grew impatient. I placed my phone face down on the table. I had no intention of debating something that would be decided in writing, in the presence of witnesses. It was remarkable how quickly people abandoned gentleness when efficiency no longer worked in their favor. Evening light filtered in through the blinds, casting narrow lines across the table. I stared at them for a moment, letting their order ground me. I didn't need his approval to prepare. I didn't need his reassurance to remain steady. Some conversations were better held without words, just documents, signatures, and the quiet honesty of paperwork. Before bed, I double-checked the notary's availability. Everything was confirmed: stamp, seal, appointment time. I scanned the draft one last time to ensure every line met legal clarity. No vague phrasing, no emotional language, no clauses that could be exploited or reframed. I placed both agreements, his and mine, into a flat file, aligning their spines so precisely they looked like two halves of the same thought. That was the point. If he asked for protection, I would accept it. But the protection would be mutual, not selective. The house was still warm from the day, and the quiet settled around me like a soft curtain. I smoothed the front of the folder with my palm, feeling the crisp edges beneath my fingers. There was nothing adversarial about this, just equilibrium. I switched off the kitchen light and let the calm follow me down the hallway. I paused before closing everything for the night, taking a moment to acknowledge the steady, undeniable truth forming beneath each decision. I wasn't opposing the marriage. I was opposing imbalance. There was a difference, and it mattered. I wrote a final line in my personal notes, one that framed the day in clean, unembellished terms. I am not resisting partnership. I am resisting inequity. Then I closed the notebook gently, letting the cover settle over the words. My heartbeat was even, not defensive, not afraid. Something had shifted quietly, not in him but in me. A recognition that fairness didn't require volume, only boundaries. I placed the folder back on the table and stood there for a moment, fingers resting lightly along the edge. Tomorrow would bring signatures, formalities, structure, and whatever truths emerged, the documentation would reflect them clearly. Balance wasn't confrontation. It was simply the other side of his request. The conference room was colder than I expected, the kind of temperature meant for documents rather than people. A plain wooden table sat in the center, its surface polished enough to reflect the overhead light in a muted sheet. He arrived 2 minutes late, sliding into the chair across from me with a distracted nod. Our two sets of agreements rested parallel on the table, his on the right, mine on the left, neatly aligned like opposing arguments in quiet conversation. The notary checked her forms, adjusting her glasses with methodical precision. Her presence offered a kind of structure, a reminder that what happened here mattered beyond emotion. I folded my hands in front of me, grounding myself in the stillness. The hum of the vent filled the room, steady and impartial. He glanced at his agreement first, flipping through the pages quickly, without the patience to digest the language. I watched his expression remain unchanged, as if he were reading instructions he believed applied only to someone else. When the notary cleared her throat, I outlined the process in simple terms. "We'll sign both agreements today," I said, keeping my tone even. "One protects your interests, one protects mine. They stand together." He shrugged, leaning back as if the formality bored him. "Fine, whatever keeps this moving." I slid the first document toward him, his preferred prenup. He picked up the pen and clicked it without looking at me. The notary observed quietly, her hands folded on her clipboard. He didn't ask a single question, didn't pause to clarify, didn't acknowledge the seriousness of what he was signing. Efficiency again, dressed as confidence. When he finished the last page, he pushed the document toward the notary with a flick of his wrist. She stamped it carefully, ensuring each seal was clear. I took a slow breath. One agreement down, one to go. I placed my agreement in front of him next. The formatting mirrored his, same margins, same layout, same neutral tone. It was symmetry in every sense, though he didn't seem to notice. "This is redundant," he muttered as he skimmed the first page. You already know I'm not planning to cancel anything. That's fine, I replied softly. It's simply equal protection. He signed without reading, each signature fast, almost careless. Pride, or perhaps impatience, kept him from slowing down. He didn't want to appear concerned, which ironically made the process even easier for me. The notary watched each motion, verifying the placement of his initials, confirming that the dates aligned. I felt no triumph, just a quiet sense of alignment, as if two halves of an equation finally sat at the same height. When he capped the pen, the faint click echoed across the table. The notary moved through the documents with practiced precision, reading each line that required verbal acknowledgement. Her voice was steady, nearly monotone, the way people sound when they've done something correctly hundreds of times. He nodded at each prompt, barely listening, eager to reach the end. I kept my eyes on him, not to scrutinize, but to observe the distance between intention and attention. He wanted the outcome without engaging with the terms. That had always been his pattern. Confidence first, understanding later, if at all. When the notary paused at a clause in my agreement, he nodded again without reading it. His pride wouldn't let him ask. The silence stretched a little before he hurried the process along with a quick, yeah, okay. But the notary didn't rush. She turned each page slowly, ensuring clarity, creating a record as clean as the ink drying on the paper. His pen skated across the final signature line, the blue ink settling into the fibers of the page with a faint chemical smell. He leaned back afterward, arms crossed, expression neutral but restless. Done? He asked, already half out of the moment. Almost, I said. I reviewed each document carefully, page by page, making sure everything aligned. Signatures, initials, dates, seals. Accuracy wasn't optional, it was the foundation. He watched me with mild impatience, tapping his foot under the table. The notary gathered her materials and confirmed the timestamp. She offered copies to both of us, her voice warm but formal. I accepted mine and placed them neatly into a labeled envelope. He shoved his copies into his bag without looking at them. Once the notary left, the room felt strangely hollow, like the sound had drained out with her. He stretched his arms with a relieved sigh, as though we had just wrapped up a minor errand, rather than formalized two legally binding agreements. I placed my envelope gently into my briefcase, listening to the soft rustle as it settled. The weight felt appropriate, neither heavy nor light, just accurate. He glanced at me, searching for reassurance or maybe gratitude. I offered neither. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about structure, boundaries, clarity. As I stood, the chair legs made no sound against the floor. I looked once more at the documents on the table, now stamped, sealed, irreversible. Paperwork had a way of expressing truths people avoided saying aloud. He headed for the door first, confident the moment was behind us. But signatures don't stay behind. They follow. They shape. They define. After the signing, he walked beside me toward the exit, the hall lights casting soft reflections along the polished floor. Well, he said with a quick, clipped smile, that makes things fair. The word fair hung oddly between us, too light, too practiced, as if he were performing the idea of balance rather than believing in it. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It folded in the middle, precise but strained, like a paper crease pressed too sharply. I didn't respond right away. Fairness wasn't a proclamation. It was a structure, a boundary, something measurable in clauses and conduct, not in a tight grin meant to suggest victory. I watched him tuck his hands into his jacket pockets, shoulders lifted with a hint of self-satisfaction. We walked in silence until the doors slid open and a draft of cool air brushed between us, clearing the residue of the conference room. He exhaled sharply, as if relieved to be done with something he never fully engaged with. I let the quiet fill the space between us as we stepped outside. Fairness, to me, wasn't about one person winning or another losing. It was about equilibrium, a shared foundation rather than a tilted one. He seems to interpret it differently, though, as if he had secured some sort of upper hand simply by having both agreements signed. Maybe he expected me to praise his flexibility or reassure him that everything felt normal again. But this wasn't a moment that needed reassurance. It needed acknowledgement, the kind that didn't come in hurried smiles or self-congratulatory tone. He unlocked his car with a quick click and glanced at me expectantly. I chose not to fill the silence for him. We were both adults. We could carry our own weight, including the weight of our choices. I kept my breathing steady, letting the air settle in my lungs, like a reminder of what clarity felt like. Later that evening, a notification lit up my phone. A screenshot from him, sent to his mother. A message beneath it read, "Handled it. Told her how it's gonna go." The wording was casual, almost flippant, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't partnership he was celebrating. It was control. I stared at the screen for a moment, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet recognition. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think no one is watching. His mother had always admired his confidence. He'd always wanted to impress her with the illusion of leadership. Tonight, that illusion found its way into my inbox unintentionally. I saved the screenshot, labeling it with the date and time. Not out of spite, out of discipline. Documentation kept everything honest. Then I set the phone down gently, letting the message settle into its own meaning. The mask he wore wasn't malicious. It was simply thin. I walked to my desk and reviewed the file containing the wedding expenses I had covered. Each transaction was clear, each line precise, each item paid without hesitation. I had invested in the future we had planned, not anticipating that fairness itself would become something negotiated. As I flipped through the receipts, I noticed how many of them had been decided jointly: venue, catering, photography. Yet the payment had been singular. Mine. Not because I minded, but because contributing felt natural at the time. Partnership had meant sharing the load. It still meant that to me. In the quiet of the room, I felt the steady pulse of certainty rise. Not defensive, not reactive, just aware. Contributions weren't leverage. They were facts. And facts, once documented, spoke plainly. I opened my messaging app and typed a simple note into the personal thread I kept for clarity. No private disputes, legal only. It wasn't a warning, just a reminder to myself. Structure over chaos, process over emotion. When conversation slipped into heat or confusion, paper brought things back to level ground. He sent another message soon after, a series of light-hearted emojis meant to smooth over the earlier tone. I didn't respond. Not because I was upset, but because I preferred coherence over contradiction. I turned off notifications, letting the silence take shape again. There was something grounding about choosing not to react, not to fill the space he created with explanations he hadn't earned. That night, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair slowly, watching my reflection soften beneath the warm bathroom light. I looked the same, but something inside had shifted. A subtle tightening of clarity, a quiet refusal to shrink for the sake of harmony. I wasn't resentful. I wasn't disillusioned. I was simply awake. The agreements we'd signed earlier were more than paperwork. They were a threshold, one he didn't realize he'd crossed. He saw signatures. I saw structure. He felt triumph. I felt balance correcting itself. I thought of the future we were building, of the home we hoped to share. Love was still present, but so was the awareness that love didn't require surrender. Not mine, not anyone's. I placed the brush down gently, steadying my breath. Tomorrow would continue as usual, but with a new understanding threading quietly beneath it. The air in the conference room felt heavier the second time we stepped inside, as if it remembered everything we had signed the day before. I placed his prenup on the table, smoothing the corners, keeping my hands still. He sat to my right, straight-backed, expression composed in that way people adopt when they believe the outcome is firmly tilted in their favor. I lifted the first page and signed my name without hesitation, each stroke of the pen measured but confident. He watched me for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly as if expecting some last-minute wavering. But my hand didn't shake. The pages turned cleanly beneath my fingers, the ink settling quickly into the fibers. Signing his document didn't feel like surrender. It felt like clarity. Every line I signed was a confirmation of structure, his and mine, coexisting side by side. By the time I reached the final page, my breath had settled into an even, unbroken rhythm. It was not compliance. It was completion. When I finished, the notary stepped forward, checking every signature with the same deliberate attention she'd shown the day before. Her stamp sounded crisp against the paper, a small percussion of finality. She handed me the copy to keep, the embossed seal catching the fluorescent light in a faint shimmer. Then I slid my own agreement forward, placing it deliberately in front of her. She reviewed it with equal care, eyes tracing the mirrored architecture of clauses he'd signed so casually. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, impatience written in the way his foot tapped lightly against the carpet. She sealed my document as thoroughly as she had sealed his. The symmetry wasn't spoken aloud, but it lived in the echo of every stamp. I requested digital scans of both agreements afterward. "Send them to both parties," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Electronic timestamp included." The assistant nodded, gathering the documents and moving toward the scanner with quiet efficiency. He gave me a small, dismissive smile, one of those expressions meant to signal confidence without actually offering reassurance. He had convinced himself that this process affirmed his position, not realizing it had affirmed mine just as much. I didn't correct him. Some truths didn't need to be narrated. They revealed themselves in time, often in writing. I watched as the assistant returned with 2 neatly stacked sets of scanned copies, placing them before us. The email notification arrived on my phone moments later, confirming receipt. Everything was documented, everything was even. He grinned as we walked out of the room, a quiet satisfaction settling across his face. It wasn't the warm kind of smile couples exchange after completing something meaningful together. It was the kind people wear when they believe they've secured an advantage. He didn't say much, just a soft exhale through his nose, chin tilted slightly upward. I didn't mirror his expression. I didn't need to. I could feel the steadiness inside me, like a clean line drawn across a page. The hallway was long, lit by a series of ceiling lamps that cast a gentle glow along the walls. I walked a step ahead, the weight of the stamped documents resting evenly in my hands. He seemed relieved, unaware that relief belonged equally, perhaps even more so, to the person who had prepared most carefully. Some victories look louder than others. Some look quiet, almost imperceptible. But they are victories nonetheless. I reached the exit first and held the door open. The late afternoon light spilled across the floor in warm strips, softening the edges of the moment. He stepped out beside me, glancing once more at his phone, as if already mentally filing this day away as a completed task. I slipped the documents into my bag, aligning them with deliberate care. Their edges rested perfectly straight against the inner sleeve, the weight of them even and calm. He glanced over, expecting perhaps a relieved smile, or a reaffirmation, or something that told him we were back on track. I offered a small nod instead, polite, steady, unburdened. Sometimes the most important confirmations are the ones given to yourself. As I walked toward the car, the air around me felt clearer, the kind of clarity that arrives only after a decision has been fully executed. I could feel the shift,
Not dramatic, not emotional, just precise. The agreements were no longer drafts or hypotheticals. They were enacted, stamped, mirrored. He followed behind me at an easy pace, humming softly, as though the day had ended neatly for him. And maybe it had. But neatness and fairness weren't the same thing. Fairness required intention. Fairness required balance. Fairness required attention to detail. Something he'd never fully understood. I unlocked my door and paused for a moment, watching the faint reflection of the building in the car window. Documentation had its own quiet power. It didn't shout. It simply held. And now, so did I. Later that evening, while I was brushing crumbs from the kitchen counter, my phone lit up with another screenshot. His message to his mother again. Got her to sign both. Told you I'd handle it. The phrasing wasn't new, but the tone had sharpened. A subtle tightening of ego, a small victory recounted like a boast. He wasn't sharing partnership. He was reporting conquest. I let the phone rest against the counter for a moment, letting the words settle into the quiet. I didn't feel anger, just an unmistakable clarity. When people speak freely to their confidants, they reveal the version of themselves they believe is truest. And this was his. Confident, certain, unaware of the equal footing he had just given me by signing both documents without hesitation. I saved the screenshot, added the timestamp, and stored it neatly in the ledger. Then I set the phone screen down on the table,
the decision soft and deliberate. I opened the ledger on my laptop and added the message to the ongoing record. Each folder grew by a single line, a quiet accumulation of context. The act wasn't driven by suspicion, just by discipline. Documentation kept emotion separate from truth, structure separate from interpretation. I watched the file save, the small progress bar moving steadily. Outside the window, a trace of cold wind brushed against the glass, a soft whisper against the pane. I leaned back slightly, allowing the room's stillness to settle over me. The ledger didn't judge. It didn't react. It simply held facts the way a wall holds shadows, neutrally, truthfully, without distortion. I muted my phone afterward, letting the notifications fall away into silence. The house felt different at night, quieter, more reflective, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. I didn't feel the need to reach for him, didn't feel the pull to correct or confront. Some cracks weren't created by conflict, but by recognition. I stepped into the living room and let the dim lamp warm the corner of the space. My hands brushed the edge of the folder containing both agreements, his and mine, resting on the coffee table. The documents radiated a calm weight, a reminder that fairness was now written, not negotiated. I sat down gently, feeling the cushions settle beneath me, and let the quiet make room for thought. I thought about the small shifts in our conversations lately, the clipped tones, the subtle dismissals, the way he framed decisions as if they were already settled before I spoke. These were not new behaviors, but they had become clearer in the presence of written terms. Paper had a way of revealing contrast. I pulled the receipts for the wedding expenses closer, smoothing a few that had curled at the corners. Each payment I'd made had been intentional, steady, rooted in the belief that we were building something together. But intention didn't disappear when structure appeared. It simply grew more defined. The reflection of the lamp glowed faintly along the receipt edges. Commitment looked different under that light. Still real, still present, but no longer unbalanced. I aligned the receipts back into their folder with slow, measured care. My phone buzzed once more with a message from him, a playful string of emojis meant to undo the tone of his earlier boast. I didn't open the thread. not out of resentment, but out of a deliberate choice to maintain coherence. Mixed signals cloud clarity, neutrality preserved it. I typed a note into my private log. Emotional contact minimized, professional boundaries active. It wasn't dramatic, just procedural. A reminder to myself to remain steady, to keep conversations documented, to separate the emotional noise from the factual structure. I closed the log and let the screen dim, the room returning to soft quiet. Before bed, I walked slowly through the hallway, letting the house settle around me. I paused near the entryway, the faint glow from outside touching the floor in a thin strip. The quiet felt earned, like the kind that comes after organizing a space that had been cluttered for too long. Inside me, a shift had formed, a gentle but undeniable boundary. Not defensive, not cold, simply clear. It wasn't that I doubted the relationship, I doubted the imbalance. And doubt, when paired with documentation, became direction. I rested my hand lightly on the back of a chair, grounding my breath. The day had shown me something important, not about love, but about partnership. One was emotional, the other required structure. As I turned off the last light, the quiet wrapped itself around me, steady and sure. The next morning, light from the window stretched across the kitchen table, touching the documents I'd left there overnight. My steel pen lay diagonally over one of the agreements, its cool weight resting on the clause titled, "Termination by Groom." I picked it up, the metal familiar against my fingertips, and let the tip hover over that single line. The sound it made when it tapped the page, a small, precise click, felt different today. Not like a symbol, not like a promise, but like a seal. I read the clause again, slowly, absorbing the exact language we had both signed. No rhetoric, no assumptions. Just clean terms outlining what would happen if he chose to walk away. The pen had once represented commitment. Now it represented clarity, the kind that didn't rely on sentiment. I capped it gently, listening to the faint snap as metal met metal. That sound was sharper than I expected, almost like a lock turning. I gathered the documents and held them up to the light, checking the embossed seals. The notary's stamp reflected faintly against the morning brightness, giving the paper a subtle texture of authority. I took a photo of the seal on the final page, ensuring the timestamp aligned with the ledger. Then I opened the digital copy on my laptop and compared the metadata, timestamps, signatures, page order. Everything matched. Consistency mattered. Details were anchors when emotions tried to fog the view. The reflection of my face appeared faintly on the laptop screen, calm, almost still. The kind of stillness that arrives not from resignation, but from preparedness. Documentation wasn't dramatic, it was grounding. I saved the photo and labeled it with today's date. I forwarded the digital copies to my attorney with a short note. Executed. Both agreements intact and timestamped. There was no need for elaboration. The attachments told the story themselves. As the email sent, a quiet sense of completion unfurled inside me. Not relief, something steadier. The knowledge that every clause was now part of a written structure neither of us could casually undo. My attorney replied with a single line moments later. Received. Everything enforceable. I closed the laptop with a soft snap and placed it beside the documents. The room felt balanced, as if the air itself understood that order had taken shape. He texted mid-morning, asking if I wanted to grab lunch. The tone was light, almost breezy, as though nothing significant had been signed the day before. I replied politely but declined. My schedule was full, which was true, but the deeper truth was that I needed space to think, space untouched by his attempts at normalcy. There was a rhythm people tried to impose when they didn't want to confront the weight of their own decisions. Distraction followed by routine, routine followed by reassurance. But I didn't need reassurance. I needed honesty. And honesty lived more easily in silence than in hurried invitations. I placed the phone face down again, not abruptly but with deliberate calm. The kitchen felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that let you hear your own thoughts clearly. I stayed with that quiet a little longer. After lunch on my own, I returned to the table and opened the agreement again, tracing each section with steady eyes. I read the financial clauses, the reimbursements, the timelines, the responsibilities in the event of separation. They were neutral, factual, unemotional. But beneath the neutrality was a truth I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. I had protected myself. Quietly, thoroughly, without hostility. I set the pen down beside the folder, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. The small gesture felt symbolic, not of commitment but of precision. The pen no longer carried the weight he had given it when he first placed it in my hand months ago. It carried mine. I leaned back in my chair, letting the light warm my shoulders, feeling the calm settle deeper. Whatever happened from here, whether the wedding flowed smoothly or fractured, there was a foundation beneath me that couldn't be shaken by a sudden ultimatum or a shift in tone. The agreements existed. They were signed. They were binding. The pen rested on the table, unchanged in shape but entirely transformed in meaning. It wasn't romantic anymore, it was neutral. A tool of accountability rather than sentiment. And there was something unexpectedly empowering in that shift. I gathered the documents into their folder and locked them in the drawer, the click of the lock soft but certain. Then I stood, taking one slow breath, allowing the clarity of the moment to settle. Whatever came next would reveal him, but I no longer feared what it would reveal about me. The wedding invitations had already been mailed weeks earlier, each envelope sealed with a quiet confidence I remembered feeling at the time. Now they sat scattered across other people's kitchen tables, announcing a future that was suddenly less certain. I reviewed the bank statement showing the venue deposit, the numbers printed in clear rows, each digit undeniable. It had been my card, my name, my contribution. Nothing about that fact felt heavy, it just felt factual, like the tone of the paper in my hands. The confirmation email from the venue was still starred in my inbox. I opened it again, rereading the policies I had memorized, cancellation penalties, deadlines, refund percentages. They were written in calm contractual language, free of emotion, yet they carried a kind of quiet authority. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, falling across the table in pale stripes. Plans had been set in motion long before the prenups existed. Those plans now sat balanced on the edge of written terms neither of us could ignore. I pulled up the wedding schedule, dress fittings, tasting menus, rehearsal dates, and organized them into two columns. One labeled completed, the other pending. The list looked clinical, almost like a project timeline rather than the blueprint of a celebration. Still, I went through it slowly, noting each item with deliberate care. He had never paid much attention to the details. He preferred arriving at finished experiences rather than participating in their construction. I didn't resent that. People contribute differently. But now contributions mattered in ways they hadn't before, not as leverage, but as clarity. I closed the binder softly, letting the cover fall into place with a muted thud. The weight of the preparations felt neutral, steady, not burdensome. They were simply the facts of the life we had been building. While I worked, a notification appeared on my phone. His post on social media, a cheerful announcement about the upcoming wedding. He tagged me, included a smiling photo of us, and wrote a short caption about how everything was coming together. I didn't react. Public enthusiasm didn't negate private complexity. It simply ran parallel to it. People often curated certainty for the world, even when their own foundation felt less stable. I let the notification fade without opening it. The room stayed steady, insulated from the noise of online declarations. I returned my attention to the documents on the table, grounding myself in what was tangible. I clicked open the venue contract again, this time focusing on the refund deadlines. The cancellation window allowed partial return if notified early, Reduced return if notified later. The terms didn't sting, they simply clarified the stakes. Every cost told a story of intention, commitment, and timing. The page felt cool beneath my fingertips as I checked the calendar. The margins were slim. If certain choices were made, the difference between acting today or acting 2 weeks from now could shift thousands of dollars. I highlighted the key dates in soft yellow and added them to my ledger. Not as a threat, not as preparation for loss, just as a responsible assessment of where we stood. There was a quiet strength in knowing the exact contours of a situation. My phone buzzed again. More comments under his post. Friends congratulating us, relatives sharing old photos, messages filled with excitement. I didn't open those either. The noise around the wedding was loud, but the truth inside the process was quieter, steadier, and more important. I turned the phone face down and let the world continue celebrating a version of events that wasn't untrue, just incomplete. The house seemed to grow calmer as the digital chatter dimmed. I reached for the folder of receipts again, aligning the edges carefully. Clarity lived in the details, and the details were mine to keep in order. I leaned back slightly, feeling the stretch in my shoulders, and let the documents settle into a single organized stack. Each page reflected a step we had taken, together or alone, to build a life we both claimed to want. But wanting a life and maintaining its structure were not the same thing. The social excitement existed in its own sphere, a bright surface-level glow. But beneath that, deeper than public posts and congratulatory messages, was the written reality. Agreements, contributions, deadlines, responsibilities. Those things didn't exist to overshadow the joy. They existed to protect the people inside it. I closed the folder, pressing my palm against it once more before placing it neatly at the center of the table. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, just a quiet acknowledgement of where things stood. The countdown had begun long before this. Now I simply understood it better. My phone lit up with a message so abrupt it felt almost sterile. Canceling the wedding. No explanation, no context, just a clean, uppercase declaration sitting sharp against the dim glow of the screen. I stared at it for a moment, not out of disbelief but out of recognition. Words written without hesitation often say more than the person typing them intended. His justification came moments later. We're not aligned. Values don't match. The sentence was tidy, polished, something a person might say when they want to sound principled while avoiding specifics. I read it twice, letting the phrasing settle. It wasn't the reason that struck me, it was the deliberateness. He had chosen the cleanest possible version of retreat. I placed the phone on the table, screen up, the message glowing quietly in the center of the room. The air felt still, almost considerate, giving me space before I moved to the next step. I typed my response slowly, ensuring every word matched the clarity of the situation. Received. Proceed under agreed terms. No emotion, no argument, just acknowledgement and direction. Then I attached the section he had signed, outlined, numbered, time-stamped, detailing the exact obligations triggered by a groom-initiated termination. I reread the message once before sending it. The calmness wasn't forced, it was earned, built through every moment of preparation leading to this point. The clause existed for a reason, and now it simply activated itself. When the message delivered, the screen dimmed automatically, folding the exchange into quiet finality. I didn't add anything else. There was nothing else to add. I forwarded the entire conversation to both attorneys with a neutral subject line. Notice of groom-initiated cancellation. My tone remained as even as the text itself. I included the timestamp, the clause reference, and the attachments. Clean, factual, procedural. The moment I hit send, a subtle steadiness settled over me, like the quiet after closing a heavy door. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't sadness. It was structure taking over where emotion might have tried to intervene. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the coolness of the room more sharply now. My heartbeat stayed measured, unhurried. The process had begun, and the process would carry itself forward. There was nothing to negotiate. It was already written. I glanced at the clock and noted the exact minute. Documentation relied on precision. I opened the ledger and added the entry. His message, my acknowledgement, the clause number, and the time. Then I closed the folder gently, ensuring the edges aligned. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. I let the sound anchor me, steady and rhythmic. There was no need to interpret his words or guess at the emotion behind them. He had offered a clear, definitive action. My breathing remained calm as I read the message one last time. No adjectives, no pleas, no hesitation, not even anger. People often reveal more truth through what they omit than through what they say. I didn't text him again. There was no reason to. He had chosen the path, and the agreement now guided the next steps. The house felt unusually still, as though it understood that a threshold had been crossed. Quiet, irreversible, clean. Notification bubbles continued appearing on my screen. Friends reacting to his sudden change, family members messaging me in confusion, relatives forwarding screenshots. I didn't open any of them. Reaction wasn't necessary. Explanation wasn't required. I kept the phone face down, letting the world swirl without me for a moment. The silence was not avoidance. It was preservation. I stood and walked toward the window, the evening light washing the room in a pale, cool glow. The horizon looked steady, untroubled, indifferent to the message that had just shifted the direction of two lives. I rested my hand lightly on the windowsill, letting the stillness seep in. This wasn't the ending of anything I had built. It was simply the activation of a structure meant to protect what I brought. He had chosen clarity, perhaps without realizing it, but choice was still choice. And written terms do not bend just because the moment feels emotional. I turned back to the table, seeing the folder exactly where I had left it. Calm, organized, ready. There was no weight in the room except certainty. I picked up the folder, feeling its balanced thickness in my hands, and exhaled once. Everything from this point forward would follow a process. Not sentiment, not argument, process. And I was prepared for that. The morning after his cancellation message, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank document open on my laptop. The cursor blinked steadily, unhurried, as if acknowledging the weight of what needed to be done. I began typing the demand letter with a calm that felt almost clinical. This notice serves as a formal request for reimbursement pursuant to the executed agreement. The language was precise, devoid of emotion, anchored fully in the terms he had already signed. I listed each category of cost: venue, deposits, attire, services. Then I attached the ledger and labeled it Annex A. Every entry was time-stamped, verified, organized. There was no ambiguity, no narrative, no opinion, just facts. The stillness in the room made the tapping of the keys sound deliberate, each sentence a quiet affirmation of structure. When I finished the first draft, I reread it carefully, adjusting a phrase here, clarifying a reference there. Nothing about the process felt confrontational. It felt procedural. I attached the ledger, added a signature block, and saved the document under a neutral file name. Then, with the same steady intention, I emailed it to him and both attorneys. The subject line read simply, "Request for execution of agreement." The body of the email contained no explanation, no frustration, just the legally relevant information and the deadline for transfer. Funds due within 7 business days by 5 p.m. It was the exact timeline he had agreed to, nothing more, nothing less. When I pressed send, I felt no rush of adrenaline, just a quiet confirmation that a step had been taken, the kind of confirmation that didn't need emotion to feel complete. A few seconds later, delivery receipts appeared, small green check marks lined neatly, like witnesses acknowledging what had been initiated. I closed the laptop gently. I added the sent email to the ledger, labeling it Item 32. The numbering gave the process a calm rhythm, like chapters in a well-organized report. I scrolled through the previous entries, messages, receipts, timelines, and saw how seamlessly this new one settled into place. Then I stood and walked to the counter, pouring myself a glass of water. The coolness grounded me, the simple action evening out the intensity of the moment. This wasn't devastation. It wasn't even surprise. It was implementation. He had initiated the clause. I was carrying it out. The distance between those two truths felt steady, almost clean. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. His reply arrived as a single sentence. "Can we talk privately?" No subject line, no context, just an attempt to revert to an informal channel. The request felt soft, almost pleading, but tone alone could not override terms already in motion. I typed a one-line response. "Please direct all communication through counsel." Then I archived the thread. My pulse didn't spike. My breath stayed even. People often reached for familiarity when consequence appeared. But familiarity had no standing in a process governed by signatures. I set the phone aside, hearing the faint hum of the refrigerator blend with the morning silence. The room felt grounded, as though it understood that boundaries were not cruelty, they were structure. Another message came from him shortly after. "This is getting out of hand. Let's just be reasonable." The irony of the request lingered for a moment before passing. Reasonableness was built into the agreement. He had chosen to dismiss it earlier. Now he wanted to renegotiate the rules midstream. I forwarded that message to the attorneys as well, adding no commentary. The documentation spoke sufficiently. Then I returned to the table, smoothing the front of the folder with my palm. The texture felt familiar, crisp, steady, honest. The folder didn't ask for fairness. It reflected it. I kept my silence, choosing process over reaction. Before closing my laptop for the morning, I drafted a final reminder for myself. Stay within procedure. Do not deviate into emotional negotiation. It wasn't a correction, it was reinforcement. Clarity had gotten me this far. It would carry me the rest of the way. The kitchen light shifted as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the stack of documents with a soft, even glow. I placed a bookmark ribbon inside the ledger where today's entries ended, then closed it gently, letting the cover fall into place without sound. Nothing in me trembled. Nothing in me hesitated. The steps were already outlined, and I was simply following them. People often misunderstand calm for indifference, but calm, true calm, comes from knowing exactly where you stand. And I did. The call began with a soft chime, both attorneys joining in before he did. I sat at my desk with a ledger open beside me, my notes aligned in a neat column. "Let's start by stating the purpose," my attorney said, voice steady and even. I repeated the subject line clearly, outlining that the call was to confirm the enforceability and timeline of the obligations triggered by his cancellation. He stayed silent for a moment too long, as though debating whether to speak at all. When he finally did, his voice carried a strained politeness. "I think there's been an overreaction." His attorney cleared his throat lightly, signaling caution. I didn't respond. Silence can be a form of precision, allowing the room to hear itself. My attorney continued, citing the clause numbers, the timestamp, the signed pages. Nothing about the tone was aggressive. It was factual, procedural, grounded. The structure of the call formed around that clarity. His attorney attempted a gentle opening. "Perhaps there's room for a mutual agreement outside the strict terms." But mutuality required equal footing, something he had stepped away from the moment he initiated the cancellation. My attorney's response was calm. "The parties already have a mutual agreement. It was signed, notarized, and fully executed. We're simply following its terms." I listened, hands resting lightly on the edge of the ledger. The room around me was quiet, except for the steady cadence of legal language. There was no accusation, no escalation, just a clean continuation of what had already been written. He exhaled sharply on the other end of the line, the microphone catching the frustration he hadn't intended to reveal. I opened the audio file from the parking lot conversation and waited for the right moment. When his attorney suggested that the initial ultimatum was misinterpreted, I spoke for the first time. "I'd like to play a brief clip for accuracy." The recording played his exact words, steady and unmistakable. "If you don't sign, we cancel the wedding." Silence followed, longer than before, heavier. His attorney cleared his throat again, this time with less confidence. "We'll need a moment to review that internally," he said. I saved the timestamp in the ledger as I muted my microphone. The truth didn't need amplification. It only needed to be heard. After a few moments of regrouping, his attorney returned with a more restrained tone. "We understand the clause applies," he said carefully. "We'd like to request additional time to prepare for the transfer." My attorney leaned closer to his microphone. 7 business days were agreed upon and notarized. We can extend by 1 day as a courtesy, not as a renegotiation. On the other end, he cut in abruptly, voice sharp. "I said I was joking when I said that earlier. I didn't mean it like that." I kept my eyes on the ledger. "Intent is determined by signed agreements and recorded statements," my attorney replied, "not by revisions after the fact." There was no argument after that, just silence, the kind that fills a room when denial collapses. The call moved into logistics: transfer method, documentation of receipt, confirmation of amounts. I took notes quietly, my handwriting steady, each line falling into place with measured care. There was nothing personal left in the conversation. It had become a matter of execution, not emotion. His voice softened near the end, trying for something gentler. "I didn't think it would go this far," he murmured. I didn't answer. My attorney summarized the next steps, restated the deadline, and thanked everyone for their time. Professional, clean, complete. The call ended with a subtle click, the digital equivalent of a door closing. When the disconnect tone faded, I sat still for a long moment, letting the quiet settle back into the room. My notes were organized, the ledger updated, the next steps clear. I closed the notebook softly, feeling the edges of the cover press lightly against my palm. There had been no confrontation, no raised voices, no emotional unraveling, just truth presented, acknowledged, and recorded. The structure had held exactly the way it was designed to. I stood, stretching slightly, noticing the calm in my breath. Not triumph, not vindication, just steadiness, the grounded kind that comes from knowing I had followed every step with clarity. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves recognized the closing of a chapter. I placed the ledger back into the drawer and exhaled once, slowly. The process was moving forward, and I was moving with it. Not ahead, not behind. Aligned. Later that evening, I sat alone at the table where everything had begun. The same wooden surface, the same quiet room, the same cool air drifting through the open window. I picked up my pen and let the metal tip tap once against the folder. Then again. Slow, deliberate taps that filled the silence with a steady rhythm. It wasn't impatience. It was alignment. The 2 agreements sat beside me, both already enforced, both already acknowledged. I traced the edge of the top document with the back of my fingernail, feeling the faint texture of embossed seals beneath the paper. The ledger lay open as well, its pages marked neatly with the day's entries. Nothing about the moment felt heavy. It felt simply measured, like the pause between breaths before the next step. The tapping continued, not as a signal but as a reminder. Everything was now moving according to structure, not sentiment. The room accepted the rhythm without resistance. I opened the agreement to the reimbursement clause and read it once more. Not because I doubted it, but because precision carries its own kind of calm. Each line was a small, evenly spaced step on a staircase of logic. Line by line, it climbed toward an outcome we had both signed for, whether he liked it now or not. My finger followed the text as though tracing a map. The wording was clear, neutral, free of emotional language. It didn't accuse, didn't assume, didn't punish. It simply outlined. And outlining was a form of mercy, because ambiguity had always been the birthplace of conflict. I closed the page gently, letting it fall back into place with a soft sigh. A text from an unknown number appeared on my phone. "Please talk to him. He's upset. Maybe you two can fix this privately." No name, but the tone carried enough familiarity to guess. I didn't open the thread. I forwarded it to my attorney instead, marking the time in the ledger. It didn't matter who had sent it. The point was the same. Someone hoping to pull the process back into the realm of emotion, where structure could be softened and terms reinterpreted. But I had learned enough to recognize that detour for what it was. I placed the phone face down and resumed my notes. I dragged an index card from the drawer and wrote a small reminder in clean handwriting. Boundaries active. Then I placed it at the edge of the ledger like a quiet instruction to myself. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the curtain lightly. Inside, the house held its silence. I rolled the pen between my fingers, feeling the familiar weight. The calm I felt wasn't apathy, it was intention, the kind that no pleading text or indirect message could disrupt. Someone had tried to reframe the situation as emotional, but this wasn't emotional, it was procedural, and procedures protect everyone involved, even the person who tries to sidestep them. I checked the deadline he had been given and wrote it onto the next clean page of my notebook. One date, one time, nothing more. Another message buzzed on my phone, this time from him. "Can we settle this without lawyers? I'm willing to talk now." I read it once, then forwarded it without response. My attorney would reply on my behalf, with the same clarity the agreement required. The temptation to respond emotionally flickered for a split second, not out of longing, but out of the remnants of habit. But clarity had no need for habit. It needed consistency. I took a slow breath and placed the phone farther from reach. The ledger remained open, its neat rows reflecting a steadiness that felt more grounding than any conversation could offer right now. The last thing I did before closing the folder was tap the pen once more against its spine. One clean sound, soft but decisive. I watched the pen settle into stillness, the metal catching a faint glimmer from the lamp. It struck me how different its meaning had become. It had once symbolized a future shaped together, an object wrapped in sentiment. Now it anchored me in reality, a tool of clarity rather than hope. And there was something unexpectedly empowering in that shift. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, listening to the soft thud as it came to rest. Everything was in place. Everything was documented. Everything was steady. The room felt aligned with me, as though the house itself understood the boundary I was reinforcing. Then I turned off the lamp, letting the quiet fill the space. The night didn't feel uncertain. It felt orderly. The next morning, sunlight stretched across the table in long, quiet stripes. My phone buzzed with a message from him. It was just paperwork. Don't make this bigger than it is. The line sat flat on the screen, stripped of reflection, heavy with the familiarity he relied on. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the file labeled Parking Lot Summary and forwarded it to the attorneys. The timestamp from that night, clean, undeniable, rested at the top. I set the phone down gently. His message wasn't surprising. People often minimize the meaning of their own actions when consequences arrived. But written terms didn't shrink just because someone wished they would. I took a sip of water, letting the coolness bring me back into the moment. His attempt to reframe the situation didn't disrupt the clarity of what had been said, recorded, and signed. The room remained steady. Another message arrived. I was joking. That ultimatum wasn't serious. This time I paused before forwarding it. Not because I believed him, but because the contrast between the recording and his revision was stark. I attached the audio clip in my email to my attorney and added a brief note. For reference. Black and white terms don't bend for retroactive excuses. Jokes don't require notaries, signatures, or legal counsel. And jokes don't result in cancellation messages typed in capital letters the night before. I updated the ledger with the new entry, marking the inconsistency with clean, neutral language. No interpretation, just record. My pulse stayed even, my handwriting steady. His mother called next. The phone vibrated twice before rolling to voicemail. I didn't pick up. Her voice filled the room a moment later, muffled but urgent. He didn't mean any of this. Please be reasonable. He's just overwhelmed. I forwarded the voicemail without listening to the rest. Emotional appeals had no weight against notarized agreements. Overwhelm didn't negate obligations. And reasonableness wasn't defined by avoidance. I added the missed call to the ledger, noting the attempt at emotional intervention. People often reached for sympathy when structure began to tighten. But boundaries didn't soften just because someone else panicked. I set the phone aside again. My attorney sent a short reply confirming receipt. We will respond only through formal channels. Do not engage privately. The guidance aligned perfectly with my own instincts. Personal conversations had already created enough distortion. I opened the folder and checked the deadlines again. 2 days had already passed. 5 remained. The numbers offered clarity, not pressure. Deadlines were neutral, simply markers that shaped decisions. I highlighted the date on my calendar and closed it with a soft tap. The sound echoed lightly, like a reminder to stay anchored. The house felt composed, even as the messages outside it grew frantic. In the afternoon, he tried again. We can work this out ourselves. No need to drag others into it. The phrasing twisted the situation into something smaller than it was, as though attorneys had been imposed rather than mutually involved from the start. I forwarded the message without commentary, then muted his thread entirely. Not out of dismissal, but out of discipline. Noise didn't change facts, and private conversation had already proven unreliable. I glanced at the ledger once more, seeing how neatly each new entry aligned with the ones before it. Patterns formed on their own when you didn't interrupt them. Before closing the drawer for the night, I placed all the day's new documents inside. Messages, timestamps, forwarded emails, the voicemail transcription. The drawer shut with a soft, assured thud, sealing the entries like chapters already written. I exhaled slowly, feeling the air move through me in a steady line. His desperation didn't unsettle me. It didn't pull me back into old rhythms of reassurance or negotiation. Instead, it clarified one undeniable truth. Clarity was no longer shared, but structure was. I walked to the living room window and watched the late light settle across the neighborhood. Calmness wasn't indifference. It was understanding. Understanding what had been said, what had been signed, and what could not be undone by regret or revision. The night felt balanced, as if the world itself recognized the shift. I stood there a moment longer, breathing evenly. Everything was in motion, and every part of it made sense. By the next morning, he tried again, this time with a tone meant to sound conciliatory. What if we meet halfway? The message appeared on my screen just as I was pouring tea. Halfway had never been the issue. The agreement was already mutual. What he wanted was a revision disguised as compromise. I forwarded the message to my attorney without responding, then checked the ledger to update the timeline. My fingers moved steadily, the process familiar now, almost meditative. The agreement didn't ask for my forgiveness, my flexibility, or my interpretation. It asked only for adherence. As the tea cooled beside me, I read his message once more. this time with the distance of someone reading a report. It wasn't personal. It was predictable. People often offered compromise only when they realized leverage had shifted. I saved the screenshot, labeled it with the date, and closed the phone quietly. An hour later, his attorney called a meeting request. The subject line read, "Discussion of revised terms." My attorney declined immediately with a single sentence. Executed agreements cannot be renegotiated after unilateral termination. The clarity was refreshing. I scrolled through the email thread, noting the shift in his attorney's tone. Longer sentences, softer wording, careful phrasing. Their strategy was changing. They were trying to soften the edges of a structure that had already hardened. I added the email to the ledger under the heading, "Attempted Renegotiation." No commentary, just record. Then I went back to my tea, now lukewarm but grounding all the same. By noon, his attorney attempted a different tactic, questioning the validity of the notarization. "There may have been oversight," he wrote. "Potential issues of enforceability." I opened the digital folder containing the scanned documents and pulled up the e-notary log. The timestamp, seal verification, and witness record all aligned perfectly. I forwarded them along with a single line, "Please confirm receipt." My attorney followed with a stronger reply, citing statutes, verification protocols, and the chain of custody of both agreements. There was nothing vague about it. It was airtight. The attempt to contest validity dissolved instantly. His attorney's reply was short. "Acknowledged." I saved the entire thread. Later that afternoon, he messaged again, this time with a different tactic. "That's not what I meant when I signed. You know I didn't intend this." I read the line twice, feeling none of the pull such words might have once carried. Intent wasn't determined retroactively. It was determined in the moment ink met paper. I typed nothing. Instead, I placed his message beneath the parking lot transcript and the cancellation message. 3 pieces that aligned perfectly, forming a timeline he could no longer argue with. My attorney emailed a concise response to his side. "Intent is evidenced by signed documentation and recorded statements. Nothing more, nothing less." The silence that followed from his end lasted longer this time. In the evening, another proposal arrived, this one from his attorney rather than him. Client proposes a partial settlement to avoid further strain. The phrasing tried to sound collaborative, but the subtext was clear. They wanted to reduce the cost of his decision. My attorney responded with a single question that cut cleanly through the attempt. "Which clause of the executed agreement permits partial fulfillment?" There was no answer. Not then, not an hour later, not even by the end of the night. I documented the proposal and its silence. Patterns reveal themselves best when you don't interfere. As the night settled in, the house dimmed into a quiet that felt almost protective. I sat at the table again, reviewing the ledger from top to bottom. Each entry reflected a step taken, not by me alone, but by both of us. His choices, my documentation, the agreement that bridged them. The failed renegotiations didn't frustrate me. They clarified him. And they clarified me. There was a difference between emotion and structure, between revision and responsibility. I closed the ledger gently and placed my hand flat on its cover for a moment. My heartbeat was calm, steady, certain. Nothing about this process felt chaotic anymore. It felt orderly, because I had chosen order every step of the way. When I turned off the kitchen light, the room went dark with a softness that felt earned. By the 5th day, the quiet around the house felt different, denser, more intentional. The deadline was drawing closer, marked clearly on my calendar with a thin black line. I sat at the dining table with the ledger open, reviewing his messages from the past 2 days. Each one carried a new angle: confusion, apology, irritation, negotiation. A shifting spectrum, none of which altered the clause he had activated. I scrolled to the cancellation message again, the one he had typed in capital letters. The timestamp beneath it felt colder than I remembered, as though it had grown sharper over time. I saved it once more in a backup folder, not out of fear, but out of discipline. Outside, the sky dimmed into a muted gray, a quiet mirror of the moment. The deadline was a boundary, a line he had set in motion, and I was simply walking the path already outlined. His attorney emailed mid-morning with a new proposal. Client requests installment payments. The request was framed politely, but stretched thin. Installments implied negotiation. The agreement did not. My attorney replied with a short, unwavering sentence. Full amount due by deadline, per signed terms. I read the exchange twice before filing it into the ledger. My breath stayed steady, even as the pressure on their side grew more visible. Installments weren't about inability, they were about delay. And delay was another form of avoidance. I closed the email thread and reached for a glass of water, letting the coolness settle the moment. Some truths didn't require reaction, only acknowledgement. By afternoon, he called. I let it ring until it stopped. He called again, then again. After the fourth attempt, he sent a message. Please, just talk to me. You're taking this too far. I forwarded each missed call and the message to my attorney, then muted the thread entirely. There was nothing to discuss privately. Private spaces had created the imbalance. Public, documented channels corrected it. I walked to the window, watching a bird land on the fence outside, its wings folding neatly against its body. The simplicity of the moment grounded me. Clarity didn't need conflict to prove itself. The phone buzzed again in the background, then fell silent. Late afternoon brought another shift, an email from his mother. He's devastated. Money is tight right now. Please be understanding. The plea sat in my inbox like a soft knock on a door I no longer opened. I forwarded it without comment and added a ledger entry marking the attempt at emotional influence. Sympathy and structure were not opponents, but they belonged in different rooms. I revisited the clause in the agreement, reading it slowly. It wasn't punitive, it was protective. The terms didn't demand pain, they demanded accountability. And accountability wasn't cruelty, it was alignment. I closed the folder with deliberate calm. As evening settled in, he tried once more. Let me pay half now, half later. I'm trying. The effort sounded sincere, but sincerity didn't rewrite signed obligations. The amount was not negotiable. The timeline was not negotiable. The terms weren't emotional, they were structural. I forwarded the message and locked my phone. Not angrily, not coldly, just firmly. The house around me felt still, almost serene. I made tea and stood by the counter as the steam curled upward in steady spirals. The warmth eased into my hands, grounding me deeper into the present. It wasn't hardness that held me steady. It was clarity. Before bed, I reviewed the ledger one more time, scanning through the entries with quiet focus. Every step taken, every message forwarded, every timestamp logged. It all formed a clean line leading to the same destination. The deadline wasn't an attack. It wasn't revenge. It was the fulfillment of a signed decision he had initiated. The house hummed softly as I closed the ledger, the pages pressing together with a final, even sound. I placed it back into the drawer, aligning it neatly with the folder beneath it. Everything in order, everything in motion. I paused at the doorway and let the silence wrap around me like a calm certainty. Tomorrow would bring the 6th day, then the 7th. Whatever he decided to do, or not do, would simply meet the terms he had activated. I turned off the light, the room falling into darkness with a gentle fade. The 6th day arrived with a muted stillness, the kind that settles before a decisive moment. I sat at the table with a fresh page open in my ledger. The date looked clean written in the corner, untouched by what the day might bring. The deadline was tomorrow. I underlined it once, not for emphasis, but for clarity. My phone buzzed just as I capped the pen. His message came in short bursts. "I'm working on it." Then moments later, "I need more time." And then, "Please don't do this." I read each line slowly, letting them settle like dust on a quiet floor. They reflected urgency, regret, fear, but none of those feelings altered the terms of the agreement. I forwarded the messages to my attorney and returned my attention to the ledger. My handwriting remained steady, unaffected. Outside, a soft breeze brushed against the window, as calm as the room itself. Deadlines didn't wait for emotion. They waited for action. Late morning brought an email from his attorney. "Client is attempting to secure funds, requesting a 48-hour extension." The wording was formal but laced with strain. My attorney replied with the same evenness he'd carried since this began. "Extension denied. Terms remain unchanged." Nothing further. No elaboration, just adherence to what was already signed. I logged the correspondence, labeling it "Request for Extension, Denied." The ledger page looked organized, almost architectural, a map of choices leading to consequences. As I closed the email, I noticed how quiet the house had become, as though it too acknowledged the gravity of tomorrow. Around noon, he called again. This time I let the phone ring through to voicemail. His voice came through moments later, strained, unsettled, nearly breathless. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. "I thought you'd be more understanding." I listened only long enough to confirm the nature of the message, then forwarded it. Understanding wasn't the issue. Interpretation wasn't the issue. The issue was his own action, typed in capital letters, sent without hesitation, and captured with a timestamp he could never erase. I added the voicemail entry beneath the others, noting, "Emotional plea, no procedural relevance." My breathing stayed steady. The ledger remained clean. In the afternoon, his mother sent a long email filled with memories, regrets, and requests. She wrote about misunderstandings, about how stress had made him irrational, and about how I was the only person who could ease the situation. I read the email once, quietly. It was heartfelt, emotional, and entirely unrelated to the agreement. The contrast between sentiment and structure felt sharper today than ever. I forwarded it with a single sentence, "Filed for documentation." Then I added it to the ledger, noting the attempt at familial influence. Patterns continued to form, clean and consistent. As evening approached, another message arrived from him. "I'll send something tonight. It won't be the full amount, but it will show I'm trying." Trying wasn't fulfilling. Partial wasn't compliance. Effort wasn't execution. And the agreement did not recognize something. It recognized the full amount by the 7th day, nothing else. I forwarded the message and muted his thread again. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the table, stretching the quiet across the room like a thin, even layer. My tea cooled beside me, untouched but steady. Before bed, I opened the ledger one last time to review the entries of the day. Each note reflected a clearer picture of where he stood, not financially, but emotionally. The urgency, the bargaining, the regret, the attempts at negotiation, every part of it painted the same truth. He had not expected consequences. I closed the ledger gently, letting the pages rest in perfect alignment. Tomorrow's deadline waited in clean, calm ink. There was no dread attached to it, no anticipation, only certainty. As I turned off the lights, a quiet feeling settled into my chest, not cold, not victorious, just precise. I had followed every step with clarity. The rest was his to decide. The house fell into stillness as I walked down the hallway. The 6th day ended without disruption, without chaos, without fear. Tomorrow would simply reveal whether he understood the meaning of a signature. The seventh day arrived with a muted gray sky, the kind that carried no mood, no opinion, just neutrality. I woke early, not out of anticipation, but out of habit. My steps felt steady as I made my way to the table, the ledger waiting where I had left it. I wrote the date in the top corner of a fresh page. It looked clean, almost ceremonial. The deadline was set for 5 p.m. I underlined it once, a thin line that studied the space around it. My phone lay silent beside me until, at 8:12 a.m., his message appeared. "I'm still trying. Please just give me the weekend." I didn't hesitate. I forwarded it, archived it, and entered it in the ledger. The action took less time than reading the message itself. Outside, the morning air pressed lightly against the window. Today wasn't about emotion. Today was about the agreement completing its own arc. At noon, his attorney sent a succinct update. Client unable to secure remaining funds. Requests mediated negotiation. The phrasing was careful, but the meaning was simple. They wanted another exit. My attorney responded with the same measured tone as always. Negotiation unavailable. Terms enforceable as written. I read the exchange once, then added it to the ledger. Each entry felt like a step further into clarity. A moment later, he texted again. "You're punishing me." The words sat heavy on the screen, but without weight in the context of the agreement. I read them, forwarded them, filed them. My pulse didn't waver. The deadline did not belong to emotion. By mid-afternoon, the silence shifted. No new messages, no new emails. Just the slow, steady movement of time toward 5 p.m. I brewed tea and sat at the table, the quiet filling the room like a thin, even layer. The absence of communication didn't feel tense, it felt inevitable. He had pushed, pleaded, bargained, explained, minimized, every method except the one that mattered, fulfilling the written obligation. I checked the clock. 3:47 p.m., then 4:12, then 4:29. Each minute settled into place, unhurried. The agreement wasn't emotional, it was architectural. And this was just the final beam slotting into alignment. At 4:41 p.m., my phone buzzed. A single sentence arrived. "I can send half right now." There was urgency in the wording, but partial wasn't compliance. Not today, not under these terms. I forwarded the message and returned to my tea. The steam had thinned, drifting upward like a quiet exhale. I sipped it slowly, grounding myself in the moment. The clock continued its steady march toward the hour. When it reached 4:59, the room felt almost still enough to hear the soft echo of time itself. The deadline felt neither sharp nor dramatic. It felt exact, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting. At 5 p.m. exactly, I wrote one line in the ledger. Deadline reached. No transfer received. The simplicity of the sentence made the air feel cleaner, as though the room itself approved of the clarity. My attorney sent a confirmation minutes later, proceeding with next steps per agreement. There was no triumph in the moment, no sting, no sorrow, just quiet alignment between action and consequence. I closed the ledger gently, the pages falling together with the softest sound. The house settled into an evening hush as I stood and walked toward the window. The sky had darkened into a muted blue, the last light fading along the rooftops. I rested my fingertips on the glass, feeling its cool steadiness. The day had completed itself. He had chosen not to fulfill the terms. And choice always carries its own weight, one that cannot be shifted by apology, urgency, or regret. The structure we signed together had now taken full shape, and it would guide every step that followed. I walked back to the table, placing my palm on the closed ledger. Its shape felt grounding, honest, complete. Nothing about the moment felt harsh. It felt correct. I exhaled softly, letting the air leave my chest in a single calm line. Tomorrow would begin the next phase. Tonight simply marked the end of this one. The next morning, the air felt sharper, as if the edges of the day had been outlined overnight. I sat at the dining table with the ledger closed beside me, a quiet acknowledgement that yesterday had already completed its chapter. My laptop glowed softly as I drafted the formal notice. The wording came easily, not out of coldness but clarity. Each sentence rested neatly on the page, factual, neutral, precise. I attached the documentation, the timeline, the messages, the missed calls, the failed transfers. The file had weight, not in emotion but in structure. It told the entire story without needing a single adjective. I read the letter once more, ensuring every line matched the agreement he had signed. Then I saved it under a clean name, one unclouded by sentiment. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the screen, steady and patient. When everything was ready, I exhaled slowly and closed the draft window. There was no rush, only sequence. At 9:14 a.m., my attorney called. His voice carried the same calm steadiness I had come to rely on. "I've prepared the filing," he said. "We'll send the notice within the hour." I thanked him and nodded, even though he couldn't see it. My gaze drifted toward the folder resting at the edge of the table. Its edges aligned with the grain of the wood, symmetrical, composed. "Are you comfortable proceeding?" he asked. "I am," I replied. My voice didn't waver. It didn't lift or dip. It simply landed where it needed to. He outlined the next procedural steps, each one clean and predictable. There were no surprises left in this process, only confirmations. After the call, I placed the phone face down and let the quiet fill the room. At 10:03 a.m., the notice was sent. My attorney copied me on the email. The subject line was short and unembellished. The attachments lined up in the body like a series of calm, composed statements. A minute later, the delivery receipt appeared. I watched the small green checkmark appear beside it, a subtle signal that the process had officially shifted into its next phase. He replied 15 minutes later. Not with denial, not with anger, just a short line filled with a kind of disbelief. "You really did this?" I didn't respond. The agreement had responded for me. I forwarded his message to the ledger folder and closed my email tab. The house remained still, as though honoring the quiet precision of the moment. Around noon, he called again. This time the voicemail came through with a strained quietness, the kind that comes when someone finally realizes a moment cannot be reversed. "I didn't think you'd take it this far," he said. "I thought you cared." I sat down slowly, listening only once. His words floated in the room for a moment before settling into the stillness. Caring and accountability were not opposites. Caring didn't mean dissolving structure. Caring didn't erase choices already made. I forwarded the voicemail to my attorney, then added a single sentence to the ledger entry for the day. Neutral, precise. The sky outside shifted to a softer shade, diffusing light through the window like a quiet reminder that the world moved forward regardless of personal desperation. In the afternoon, his attorney sent a curt message acknowledging receipt of the notice. "We will review and advise," he wrote. The tone had changed. No more negotiation attempts, no more delays, no more softened language. I reread the line once, appreciating the clean shift from resistance to procedure. It was the first moment of the entire ordeal that felt aligned on both sides. Structure had finally overtaken sentiment. I logged the message, then closed the ledger. The pages pressed together neatly, forming a single cohesive block. The house felt different. Lighter, perhaps, but not in a triumphant way. In a settled way. As evening approached, I sat near the window, watching the outline of the day fade into a pale wash of blue. The notice had been delivered. The process had begun. Nothing about the unfolding steps felt harsh or vindictive. They felt exact, like a sequence that had been waiting quietly for its turn. I rested my hand against the arm of the chair, feeling the stillness in my fingers. There was no shaking, no heaviness, no lingering doubt. Just the quiet recognition that everything had moved according to terms he had activated, not I. I stood and walked toward the table one last time, placing my palm on the closed ledger. It felt steady, anchored, familiar. I breathed in through my nose, letting the air settle into my lungs in a long, even line. Tomorrow would bring the next steps. Tonight belonged to clarity. The morning after the notice, the house felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were pausing to acknowledge the shift. I walked into the kitchen with slow, measured steps, the kind that arrive only when a long process has reached its natural end. The ledger sat on the table, closed but not forgotten. I ran my hand gently across its cover, feeling the subtle grain beneath my fingertips. My laptop chimed once. A message from my attorney. Notice delivered. Response expected within statutory window. You're fully protected. The words carried no flourish, no reassurances beyond the factual. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been secured through the signatures, the timestamps, the transfers that never came. I brewed tea and watched the steam rise in thin lines. The moment didn't feel victorious. It felt exact, like something settling cleanly into its rightful place. The day stretched ahead without tension. By noon, he sent one final message. If this is what you want, then fine. The sentence held resignation, frustration, and something quieter beneath it. An acknowledgement he couldn't put into steadier words. I read it once without reacting. It didn't require reaction. It wasn't a question, a threat, or a request. It was simply the last line of his own choosing. I forwarded it to the ledger archive and closed the email tab. The small click of the trackpad echoed softly in the quiet room. Outside, the light shifted, brightening the walls in even patches. The world was still moving, and I felt myself moving with it, not ahead or behind, but in step with the truth of what had unfolded. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to untangle, only completion. In the late afternoon, my attorney called to confirm the next steps would proceed automatically unless his side produced the required response. His tone carried no tension, only structure. Everything now rested within the system, designed to carry weight neutrally, without emotion or bias. I listened, nodding quietly as I noted the upcoming dates. My breathing stayed even, my shoulders loose. The hard part, the emotional confusion, the bargaining, the attempts to rewrite what was already written, had already passed. After the call, I stood at the window and watched a slow breeze move through the trees. The branches swayed gently, not in resistance, but in natural rhythm. There was something grounding in that simple movement, something honest. The truth didn't need force, it just needed space. I gathered all the documents one last time, aligning them into a single stack. The agreements, the messages, the recordings, the emails. They formed a quiet story of cause and effect, of choices and consequences. None of it felt heavy in my hands. It felt complete. I slid the stack back into the drawer and closed it with a soft, final sound. Not a slam, not a click, just a gentle closure of a chapter that had already concluded itself. For a moment, I stood still, letting the stillness settle around me like a calm exhale. There was no bitterness in the air, no regret, just a kind of quiet certainty that everything had unfolded with precision. Some endings don't break, they clarify. As evening approached, I stepped outside for the first time that day. The air felt cool, unbothered, expansively neutral. Cars hummed in the distance, a dog barked somewhere down the street, and a soft breeze carried the faint smell of fresh earth. The world remained untouched by the process I had lived through. I walked slowly along the sidewalk, my thoughts steady, unhurried. Nothing inside me felt tangled, nothing felt suspended. The structure had done what it was meant to do. It created boundaries where emotion once clouded them. I turned back toward the house, watching its windows glow gently in the settling light. Inside, the living room held a calm that felt almost new. I sat down on the couch and let my hands rest quietly in my lap. A single truth crystallized in the silence. I had not lost anything. I had preserved myself. The agreement he thought would protect him had protected me instead, not through conflict, but through clarity. He had relied on sentiment. I had relied on structure. And structure had carried me to the end with steady, deliberate certainty. I breathed in deeply, feeling the air expand across my ribs before releasing in one slow line. The weight that had lingered for days dissolved quietly, leaving a clean sense of completion behind. Tomorrow would bring whatever came next: paperwork, confirmations, steps carried out by people whose jobs were to follow procedure. But tonight wasn't about that. Tonight belonged to the stillness earned through choosing clarity over chaos. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle fully. The process was complete. In the end, nothing ended in flames. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shattered promises on the floor. Just a quiet house, a closed ledger, and a woman who finally understood that clarity isn't cold, it's protective. The agreement he thought would shield him had simply revealed him, page by page, timestamp by timestamp. And when the deadline passed, it wasn't a victory or a loss. It was a completion. I didn't walk away angry. I walked away steady. Sometimes the most powerful moments aren't loud. They're the ones where you choose yourself without apology, without hesitation, without needing anyone else to understand. When I closed the drawer for the last time, I knew one thing for certain. Love may begin a story, but honesty determines how it ends. And mine ended exactly where it needed to, on solid ground. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story made you think, feel, or reflect on your own boundaries, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories told in this quiet, cinematic way, don't forget to subscribe.